Welcome to the Peoria Art Guild's newest exhibition, Susanne, Nestory, The Oregon Years. This is a body of work that Jeff and I saw at Susanne's studio, and the one thing we were certain is that it had to be exhibited. It had to be shown. Susanne, if you could, thank you for doing this for us, but most of all, explain what Oregon Years is all about.
Well, I lived in Oregon at the time that I made these paintings. They're all oil. And I lived outside of Ashland, Oregon, in the foothills to the Cascades. I was in a remote location, and I was actually found myself landing in a place after my undergraduate years at Southern Oregon University, where I had the time and the space to develop this work. And at the time I was reflecting back on a lot of memories of different places I had been. And so this work is very much about memory, but also about the internal encounters that I remember.
Well, and one of those places that you were was Antarctica.
Yes.
Well, and we start out with these white paintings, as Jeff and I refer to them. And give us a little bit about what you were doing in Antarctica and how maybe that had some inspiration or at least some effect on the composition and the technique that ended up building up these incredible paintings.
Okay, yes, I was in Antarctica. I spent 4 months there, and I was working with Antarctic Services, and it was through International Telephone and Telegraph, kind of a section of that company, that hired a service crew for the National Science Foundation. So, you know, I was down there from October through February, and it was basically the spring and summer months in Antarctica. And one of the things they were doing for research was taking ice core samples, where they drilled down deep into the ice, which was everywhere, and pulled out these conical long tubes of ice and studied the different particles that were contained in the ice in terms of, you know, geologic time, composition. And through these samples, they learned more about the history of the place, which has actually traversed from tropical to frozen many times in its history. And so,
well, I think you've captured those layers through your processing of both the images that you saw, but also what the hand had to do to build up those layers. I think what's interesting too is, as we go through the exhibition, is that we have the rhombus and we have the square. And in particular, this more gray piece here is really remarkable because it is so compressed with so many mark making. And I think I've told you before, I kind of align this with American abstract expressionist Mark Tobey, who did a lot of calligraphic and very tense and contrite calligraphic markings instead of the broad gestures that the abstract expressionists were doing at the time. And when we have the square, we have it very contained. When I look at the rhombus pieces, I see it more as it's an overview of it. So we no longer have the containment of boundaries. Instead, it's able to circular-like perspective. And we go with these white ones, which are wonderful. We started with the one that was least compressed, going to this one that has so many variations of mark making. But then we transitioned to these two pieces, which are very organic and natural. And they literally, some people look at them and think that skin tones almost. But how did you build and how did you change from going from white and black particularly to using color in this way?
Well, the white and black as you work with those distinct and very subtle shades within the value range, basically I would play with temperature, warms and cools, whites and blacks, grays, lots of grays. There was a lot of gray in the landscape in the sky in Antarctica. But I think it was just mainly no longer necessarily connected to that place, but just with the act of painting and exploring this language that would lead me into different expressions of it. And so I was also trying to ask the questions about how color was operating in my work. And I was very interested in having a surface quality that kind of had a vibratory effect to it. And so I found myself gravitating towards these muted tones,
Yeah.
And so this started out as muted grays, but then, it was cool, and then I put warm in there. And basically, it's a matter of when the image starts to spark or add some kind of light. Many of the layers that I would do with this work would feel lackluster, flat. The colors, the temperatures aren't sort of in a conversation with each other. It doesn't quite feel... And it's a very short or a very small increment between feeling just sort of dull to something
that's very vibrant
something
and energized.
happens.
Energized,
Yeah.
Well, and I think what's interesting, my favorite wall here, I think it's my brother's also, are these black paintings. And I know that you did a whole series of the black paintings. And these are so incredible because there is so much mark making. And until we get right up on it, and as you discovered, Jeff and I, when we were installing them, the lighting of it is so difficult. But one night we had just turned off the lights and we were looking at them, and you could see this. You have this calligraphic web of these small marks that seem to be like the net or the matrix. And then you take another mark and you put on top of that. And then you take another mark and put on top of that. And you actually, when you're right up on it, you can see that there are layers, even though they're minuscule, and they're really transparent. The other thing is that in these larger pieces, I think we see, especially these oval shapes that you've used. And I understand that you didn't necessarily just use a paintbrush either to make your paintings.
No, I did not just use a paintbrush. There were palette knife marks, stamping, rubbing. But I liked to try and, especially with the black ones, a big part of my process was playing with different matte finishes and glossy finishes to sort of have this surface that was unified, but yet also starting to break up, But then it was coming together, but then it was falling apart again. So that tension between the two. And so there are different reflective qualities in the layers of paint. So it became largely about the consistency of paint and the media mixed into the paint and how each layer was a little different that way.
I think also when a lot of people see black paintings, and they started in the 50s. Robert Rauschenberg did black paintings. Barnett Newman, of course, is probably
Frank
the most
Stella.
famous. Frank Stella. And I can't remember, one of the critics said that that a black painting is zero painting. It's a zero painting because there's nothing. It appears there's nothing for us to really examine. But in these in particular, and I loved, instead of us having 3 large black paintings here, we really, both Jeff and I have really gravitated to this one, which is so energized, and there are so many marks on it. But yet there's not a pattern, but there's an assimilation of motion and of layering that just is so striking with this. And particularly, again, the ovals, we see this oval mark. And the oval, explain why you use the oval that, as far as one of the elements in your mark making.
Okay, well, basically, when you're just dealing with surface, it becomes very obvious that you're, also working against a rectangle format or square format. So the oval could echo the grid in certain ways because the oval has a vertical orientation, a horizontal orientation, diagonal, or it can just be
randomly placed anywhere.
Yes. And so I think the oval was important in just sort of organizing. It was an organizational shape for these works. It's not quite a dot.
No, it's not.
So yeah, that's.
And I think it's interesting because they become a little, and in the black paintings in particular, the oval sometimes has a little bit of a sheen to it. So I don't know if you used an extender or something to do just those. But on the other hand, they float up onto the surface, it seems, more than the other marks that you've made. And again, we have this one, and if you get up close to it, you notice that actually the top part is a little more submissive, I should say, as far as energy goes. There are mark making, but it really starts to really just fall together down here, and it becomes so thick and so complicated, I guess, that it's wonderful. And it's not just a black painting that has no character to it, I guess, is my point.
Well, wonderful. I was hoping for that, and with the different reflective qualities, and this kind of harkens back to my memories of Antarctica, how these black paintings are more to do with light, really, than they are with the blackness. And even though black seems like a complete negative, it does hold all of the colors in the spectrum. They are all absorbed in black.
Yep.
And so I think the floating ovals, they have more, what did you say, sheen to them, right? So that's what I was playing with. I wanted to create space. So I didn't want to just fill the space of the square with all of this busyness. I wanted to also have sort of more of a depth of space.
Well, and we talked at one time, we were teasing her about making G-clays of these and how it would do nothing but flatten everything. That you really, the experience is coming to see them in person and seeing how you manipulated these transparent layers. And you put it on top, and all of a sudden you begin to understand them. Now, this one rhombus that we have here is probably the most dainty, shall we say, as far as mark making goes. There are very few marks that are of any substance, really. These are very small points that you keep putting on.
Yeah.
And they just kind of, it's really interesting because they make it an overall experience that's so much different than the black paintings, but yet it's still the same. It's compressed even more.
Well, there's a lot more of a value contrast in the white paintings. And it was challenging for me. I mean, it was hard to see the black paintings as I was making them, but to try and have the same subtle value shift with the white was even more difficult for me to see what I was doing. So I think the values became a little darker. And then I also kept reverting back to this idea of the ice core sample, and I think the rhombus shape also echoes the four directions, and it's less of a window, right? So has more of a sense
It's an
of,
aerial to me. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a perspective that's aerial as opposed to, like you said, looking through a window where your peripheral vision is confined.
Exactly.
Slightly.
Right.
Slightly. We have these three paintings that as soon as we pulled them out of the gallery, out of the studio and put them in the gallery, they seem to talk to one another. And I know you were kind of surprised because you've never seen them exhibited all together, but let alone in this formation.
That's right. I have not. And the two smaller ones I made probably at a similar time using a similar palette and playing with different ratios of color. And I hadn't ever associated them with the central one. And you can see there are very different surface qualities between the outer one and the central one. And that has everything to do with the medium mixed in with the paint, how thin or thick it was. And this one has more of a history to it. It has, as the more manifestations beneath the surface of one of the paintings, then the surface quality starts changing more. There's more of a texture from the what's going on underneath. So,
And I think what's really interesting, sometimes, especially as curators, what we want to do is we want paintings to talk to one another and communicate some kind of idea. And I just think the three of these have so much similar, yet they're dissimilar. And I think that's what makes for a good conversation. We're going to come over and see a couple more of the black paintings that ended up more charcoal. But that's because there's variations of black. And I think people don't understand that. The other thing that I do want to make a statement about is that this entire exhibition, to the voice we thought that it had, was a very quiet and contemplative voice. Much like Agnes Martin, you have these reduced mark making so that it's not just about painting, it's about the essence of painting and how it's a quiet place to come and just reflect and do things like that. And yet we have one that is not quite as dense with the mark making, and we have this one where obviously the white dots, those points are the ones that pop out at us. And I don't know if those were actually the last points or if they were there and you just kind of worked around them, or how do you build your painting, I guess, is the real question.
The white is the last. Yeah, that is for this painting. And first of all, in terms of building, there's a lot of time for me in these between layers. I do a lot of contemplating. I'll, put something on the canvas, a layer or so, and then I will spend a lot of time looking at the painting. In fact, I could say that there was more time spent looking at all of these paintings than there was actually applying paint. And I think that has a lot to do with where I was. I was in a very quiet place. I had minimal distractions, and so I could sit and think and look for a long time between marks without feeling like, oh, I've got to.
And I know that it's quite often with abstract expressionists that 90% of a painting is sitting and thinking and contemplating rather than actual making of the paint onto the canvas. We ended the show with these two pieces, which one is very dark and one is very colorful. But we thought they related to each other so well. Not just because these are looser, but these are looser. And sometimes artists, even though you're focusing a lot on the grays and the blacks and the whites, again, color can be used in the same way that black can be used as far as non-painting. You can take this, you can find a color that you're very confident with, and then build from there. So do you want to, and is this one of the last paintings of this
Yes,
series?
this is the last painting. I mean, this painting actually was not created in Oregon. This painting was created looking back at my time on that property in Oregon. I made this painting in graduate school, and I was starting to do more color studies in graduate school, and working with geometry versus more organic marks.
Well,
And in
I love the
contrast-
triangle. You know, in art, there's always got to be a triangle someplace. Subtly, if nothing else,
Implied
implied triangle.
And it kind of counteracts the stability of the square because it's a upside down
Yes.
triangle. So yeah, and the color in this, you see ochre that is actually communicating with ochre here. And I did leave Oregon. It was hot in the summer. It was fire season. I lived in on an oak savanna property with a lot of high brown grasses and
So the palette was very natural for you.
very natural.
Very natural.
Very
natural.
Yes.
So, well, comes to the end of the exhibition. We want to thank you all so much for listening and taking this time with us. The exhibit will be up till the end of the month. We will be open Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 2, and then again on Saturdays from 9 to 4. So we hope that you can come and experience this wonderful body of work and our friend Susanne, too.
Thank you so much.